I'm going to start with one of my favourite quotes by Rumi, who's a 13th century Sufi mystic. And he said, "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop." I'm going to let you make your sense of that while I do my talk, and then we'll come back to it at the end. Hopefully you'll have some insight into this quote by the end of the talk. So in preparing for this talk, I was actually scheduled to do it about a year ago, and then COVID hit, so it got postponed. And back when I was originally asked to do it, the theme was much more on your personal narrative. And so now this year, we're including how a significant person has influenced our spiritual development over time. So I had to think about that, and I was trying to get a sense of how much of my own personal story to weave in and how much of somebody who's influenced me. So I'll be drawing on my story and King David's story from the Bible, but ultimately it's all a part of the big story that we're all a part of, that is God's story. So a little bit about me. I was born in a country called Pakistan. Anyone who's not aware, that's next to India, mostly known for its cricket or the Taliban, depending on what you read. But there it is, situated there in between India and Afghanistan. And I was born where that star is, that's in the middle of the Punjab region, about 4 hours away from Lahore, which some of you might know that city. The one circled up here is Peshawar, that's where my mum was from, and so we spent a lot of time there in our childhood as well. Peshawar is in the northwest corner of Pakistan, and it's still considered a red zone. My mum's house was 40 minutes away from where they found Osama bin Laden. So it's Taliban country, and the local government there is very, very strict. This is my favourite place on the whole planet, and I've travelled to quite a few countries. This is my village that I was born in, called Dr. Wala. It means the village with the doctor, because back then they had a doctor. And these are some pictures that are very recent. I was there last Christmas. So this is taken from the roof of my house. This one is the road leading into our village, and that's our family fields there. The village is known for its dust, how dusty it is. And as you can see, these kids sweeping the street, I don't know why they bother, but they do. And all it does is just stir up the dust. This room is extra special. That's now a kitchen, but when I was born, it was just a raw mud room, and I was actually born in that room. So it's got a special dear place in my heart, and it's now this modern looking kitchen. This is me and my cousins going for an oxen cart ride out to our fields. And this is the main street of our village, and my house is in the town centre there. So that's where I hail from. So I was born in 1983, so while Steph said I'm young, I'm not as young as I look. You can do the maths there. In 1986, so when I was 3 years old, the Pakistani government instituted a new clause into their blasphemy law. And it said that if anyone blasphemes against Muhammad or Allah, the Muslim God and Prophet, they would be sentenced to death by hanging or life imprisonment. My dad was the first one to be sentenced under this law because he had a position that was well paying and had high respect, so they tried to convert him from Christianity to Islam. My dad's a pretty stubborn man and a very passionate man, so he declined that offer and consequently ended up running for his life. He managed to escape out to Australia in 1987 as an asylum seeker. My mum and me and my 4 siblings were still in Pakistan, and we were moving around from city to city and villages to hide until we could get visas out here. In 1989, finally, they got visas for my mum and me and my siblings to come over. So this was all of us after my dad had left. And up here, I'm the one with the bald head in the front. In Pakistan, there's a tradition, they shave a girl's head for quite a few years, thinking that it'll help the hair grow back nice and thick. It worked for my sister, but not so much for me. So After that, we moved to Australia. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk you through my life, and then talk you through some of the challenges I've had, and then we'll look at David's life and the lessons I've learnt from David's life. So just in a quick snapshot, so we arrived in 89. In 1990, I started school in year 2. By 1992, at the ripe old age of 9 years old, I started a Sunday school and started putting on church productions. 96 to 2000, I did high school, won a competition, well, got third prize in place in a competition for poetry that my English teacher entered me in. In 2001, I went and lived in Taiwan for 6 months teaching English, and I commenced my double degree at QUT in Education and Human Movements. Between the years of 2002 and 2004, I was busily involved in too many church things, and uni was just something I did on the side. And so some of the things that I did there was a lot of community outreach programs, events management for different Christian organisations. In 2005, I graduated from my double degree and I moved out of home, which was a really big deal in our family, because in Pakistani culture, a girl does not move out of home until she's married, or unless she needs to for work for whatever reason. In 2006, I started my teaching career at Springwood High School, went to Iran on a scouting mission with YWAM. In 2008 to 9, I lived in Ireland and travelled around Europe for a while. Then 2010 to 2012, I did a Master of Counselling at Christian Heritage College while Irene was Dean there, so I'm very blessed to have had that input. Thank you, Irene. And that course was really life-changing for me. 2013, I returned to teaching after a bit of a hiatus from teaching, but a year later I was back at the books doing a Master of Education in Guidance Counselling while working as a special ed teacher. In 2017, I transitioned from teaching to being a guidance officer in schools. I also went to Nepal to work in some schools, and that was a dream 25 years in the making, with a dear family friend of ours who had started a number of schools in Nepal, and she takes over medical teams to deliver free medical services to the students and staff in her schools. So I got to be a part of that in 2017. I also, in that year, spent a month with the Servants to Asia group in the Philippines, living and working in the Manila slums. From 2018 to now, I'm just continuing to solidify my guidance officer career. I'm enjoying being an aunt to 12 nieces and nephews. They keep me very busy. I'm continuing to explore as much of the world as possible. I love travelling, so we're down up to 30 countries and counting still. And I'm also partnering with a number of local families and organisations in Pakistan to enhance access to education for particularly rural Pakistanis and girls. So there's my life in a snapshot, and it's very weird to see it summed up in a few slides. But what I want to talk to you about is the behind the scenes stuff that was going on through all of this. So I was raised in a Christian family, a very dedicated Christian family. Hey, Dave. And part of the Christian world that I was brought up in was very dualistic. So there was very clear black and white, wrong and right, good and bad sort of definitions of things. And somehow internally I was like, I can't do this in this framework. It felt too confining. My inner world was something that wasn't neatly on either side. So I had a very long and tough and deep journey to figure that out for myself. So a dualistic worldview assumes a universe where there are only two contrasting, mutually exclusive choices or realities. Either or, bad or good, positive or negative, them and us. It can be helpful language when you're simplifying something, when you're teaching children moral right from wrong, or helpful from harmful. But if you try and understand and explain the depth and the subtleties of life, it's too simplistic for that, which I learnt very quickly. So the list of dualistic polar opposites go on and on, but what I've noticed they all have in common is judgment and the need for resolution. Usually when we go into that either or, us, them thinking, we judge the other. So back to the dualistic worldview. I was finding it hard growing up to figure out what to do with my inside reality because it just didn't fit in those black and white boxes. Luckily for me, I'm somebody who goes with my insides rather than what I'm being told on the outside, and that did cause quite a lot of conflict between me and my family at times, but it paid off for me anyway because I feel that the place of freedom that I've come to now is worth it. So now returning to my life in a snapshot, during my early years, from 1990 to 2001 on that screen, during that time in 1991 I started self-harming. Now I was only about 8 years old at that time. That was my first episode of self-harm, and I didn't understand it. I didn't have language for it. I just started feeling these really strong emotions and I didn't know what to do with them. And my culture and my family and my church context didn't provide me a place where that was talked about. So it stayed inside. By 95, I started writing poetry just for myself, no audience, just to kind of express some of what was going on inside me. And just so you know, we are going to get a little bit heavy, but it's all good, it ends well. I'm still here, okay. So my poetry that I started writing was often very dark and disturbing. And on the odd occasion that I shared it with somebody or it got out to a teacher at school, there would be people very worried because they didn't understand how a bubbly, cheerful, friendly person could write such dark and depressing poetry. And I didn't know how to explain it to them, so I just said, I don't know, this is just how I write. By 2001, I really started to notice my lack of self-identity and dissociative symptoms. So I went as a 17-year-old in 2001 and lived and worked in Taiwan to teach English. While I was there, it was my first time away from my family, and I was living on my own there, and then I had the school community there that I was working in. On the weekends we'd do things, and they would ask me simple things like, what's your favourite colour? And I had no idea. I didn't know what foods I preferred, because I hadn't developed a strong sense of self-identity, because I was brought up in a culture that is very communal and not as focused on developing the individual identity. The dissociative symptoms started to become evident to some people around me at that time as well. That looked like me spacing out or being a bit delayed in conversations because my mind was elsewhere. By 2003, so while I was, while I was busily serving the church and the community, I started to feel niggles of becoming really, really overwhelmed. I started to feel myself unraveling, like a ball of wool that was tightly wound, and all of a sudden, it just started unraveling. But because I'm also stubborn like my dad, I'm my father's daughter, I kept it together, and I didn't let anybody know what was going on. However, by the end of 2004, I had my first breakdown. I quit all my church involvement, and I started getting therapy and some prayer ministry. Because at that point I started to get really worried for myself that no one knows this whole world that's going on inside me, and it's now starting to seep into the world that others can see, but they don't know what to do with it, so they step away. Because I was always in leadership positions in churches. Leadership is lonely, and people either didn't understand or didn't believe me when I told them what was going on inside, because I had put up such a good front. I became a master compartmentalizer. So even some of my closest friends didn't know what was going on. Yeah, and in 2005 I quit the other community services that I was involved in. In 2006, so that's when I had actually started teaching at Springwood State High School, I had my second breakdown in front of a classroom. And I had to leave the classroom, and I asked for a couple of days off, and then I never went back. During that breakdown, I had my first suicide attempt because life was too much and I couldn't find the help I needed, and the people closest to me didn't know what to do with what they were finding out. I lost all hope of me getting back on my feet. I went on the Centrelink mental health disability pension. after my suicide attempt failed. 2007, nothing changed, so I had a second suicide attempt and was hospitalised involuntarily. In 2008, while living in Ireland, although I found a great community there, I still wasn't getting the resolution I needed deep on the inside, and I had a third suicide attempt. Being on the other side of the world, I had gone there on my own. I didn't know anybody. I sought some prayer ministry from a nearby church, and then in England there was a conference on inner healing, so I attended that from some people actually from Melbourne. So after that I moved to Melbourne for a few months to continue getting ministry from them. Now, mental health is a really, there's less stigma around it now, but back then it was still very difficult to talk about, especially in my certain circles. But all these things you see on the board here, I was diagnosed with every one of them. Between the years of 2006 and 2009, by 8 different psychiatrists and medical specialists. So there was some serious stuff going on. Some of them, when they told me, I didn't even know what they meant. and I was in a state where I didn't really care. I was like, okay, you're putting language to something. During that time, in 2008, when I was in Ireland, I lost all hope. And God, in his very subtle and gentle way, restored it for me. I spent a year in this beautiful little village in Ireland called Wexford. Fell in love with the town and the people there, developed some really solid friendships. The town is on a bay there, and overlooking the bay, I was going on a walk and I was really down one day, and I saw this beautiful mosaic, and it had the word hope written in the middle. And since then, mosaics are just really special for me because this saved my life in a very, very basic way. I remember looking at that word, and my first inner response was like, whatever. But then I just made myself sit there and stare at it, and stare at the ocean behind it, and the ocean is always very calming for me. And the thought just came to me, if the word hope exists, the thing hope must exist. You don't name something that doesn't exist. So I thought, okay, so if there is such a thing as hope, I probably just haven't encountered it yet. So I'll just keep living and I'll see if I come by it. And that was what saved my life on that day. Just seeing the word hope written up. So I don't know who created that mosaic, but I'm eternally grateful to them. In 2010 to 2012, so I'm back from Europe now, I returned to study, supported by a Disability Employment Service. I had multiple breakdowns during this time, and periods of significant conflict and estrangement with my family. During this time, I was very lucky that I found a therapist who has honoured me with being here today, Dr. Johanna Lynch, who was the next thing that God used to save my life. And with her, we did some very specific work around dissociative identity disorder, which was all about me having compartmentalised and fragmented mentally and emotionally because I did not know how to make sense of my life. And with the bits that fragmented off, they just didn't fit in the molds that in the society that I was living in. And how was I supposed to bring them all back in? So Johanna, thank you. And Johanna really helped me to learn how to integrate all those parts of me that had been flung out far and wide that even I couldn't find. So I just had this lack of sense of self because I was just flung out wide in many different pieces. And slowly we recovered and resolved some of those pieces, and I learned how to reintegrate them. And it's an ongoing journey. I'm still on it. By 2013, I returned to work, still supported by a DES, and that was as a special ed teacher up at Narangba. And 2013 was my last self-harm episode. I started to feel like I was getting back up on my feet. 2014 to 2016, I continued therapy, but decreased the intensity and frequency. Then 2017 to now, I'm still on this journey of integrating all the pieces of my life into one beautiful mosaic instead of a million pieces. And that mosaic for me has been laced with grace and authenticity. I've learned how to be authentic. This is the first time I'm sharing my story like this to a public audience. I'm now at a place where I can do that. So that is comforting for me to know my own progress in that. I'm finding and enjoying the sense of self that has emerged over the years, because for so long I just didn't have one. I've learned to just live out the questions instead of frantically looking for the answers, because some answers you get and some you don't. And some answers are subtly there, some are boldly in your face. But I'm learning not to have the answers as my focus, but just to explore the questions. I'm also learning to go with the ebb and flow of life and not holding on to anything too seriously or too tightly. I'm holding open-heartedly the paradoxes, possibilities and mysteries of life, because I certainly don't have the answers yet, but I'm very comfortable with not having the answers. Over the years, I was torn between a pendulum swing. I was either thriving or I was overwhelmed, and there was nothing in between. It was all or nothing. And when I was in that overwhelmed state, that's when my self-harm and suicidal ideation would come in. I was just this major swinging pendulum. I was accused by people who understood even less than I did at the time of being a hypocrite, hypochondriac, attention-seeking, overly sensitive, drama-creating, troublemaking, hurting others intentionally as though I had control over what was happening. And those accusations were all from people quite close to me. And it was hurtful, but at the same time it was insightful, because I thought, I'm not the only one confused by this. Because I know I'm not a hypocrite. This is as real as this. Both are true, both are facts about me. And I'm not putting on a face, I'm just being that part of me. So I was also met with comments such as, why are you doing this to us? If you were reading your Bible, then you wouldn't be in this state. If you were going to church, you wouldn't be in this mess. If you were really a Christian, you wouldn't be oppressed like this. Yet I knew that I had to be honest and real to myself. So despite all those accusations and voices coming at me, I just clung to the definition of God that I had experienced through my darkness and my woundedness. Part of that, what I found God to be, was through David's journey, and also a number of other people in the Bible. So I grew up not reading many other books, so my inspiration had to come from the Bible characters. And I was really grateful to find in the Bible that there are actually a lot of people who are really depressed and really struggle with the meaninglessness and futility of life. So my favorite book was always Ecclesiastes. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And I was like, yes, it is. But I was comforted to find that in the Bible, inspired by God. Sons of Korah wrote, darkness is my closest friend. I could relate to that. Job said, darkness is my one companion. I could relate to that. Even in times where I felt God wasn't there for me, my darkness was. So finding those things in the Bible actually really helped me, really assured me that it's okay when I'm in these dark, deep places. It's not foreign to God. It's there in human experience. So one of the inspirations, like I said, was King David. Now, most of you will know his story, so I won't go too much into depth with that. It's in the first and second books of Samuel. So David reigned, was the second king of Israel during 1035-970 BC. He was a shepherd that was renowned for his passion for God, his touching psalms, and his musical abilities, his inspiring courage and expertise in warfare, his good looks and illicit relationship with Bathsheba, and his ancestral connections to Jesus. He came at a time in history where just before him there was a very tumultuous era in Israel where they went through a number of prophets and judges, and it was so much upheaval that Israel demanded a king, and God gave them King Saul. And then David came after King Saul. So David, as a musician, when King Saul started to experience a tormenting spirit, he would go into these fits of rage and depression, and his servant recommended that David come in and play the lyre for him, a harp, as a musical balm of sorts. David was also a noble warrior, so he excelled through the army ranks really quickly and had so many successes that Saul actually got jealous of him. So jealous that he started hunting him to kill him. But David had a very noble character, and even when he had opportunity to kill Saul, he didn't. David then became the triumphant king after Saul died, and straight away he experienced a 7-year civil war. So in this day and age, if a ruler inherited that, you'd think, oh, they're the best person to rule this country if we're straight away gone into a civil war. He then had some notable victories against a number of tribes, which he ended up marrying a lot of women from each of those tribes to spread the love, I guess, but also it was his way of cementing his rule and reign. So he was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years, and in that 40 years, that was the golden era of Israel. During this time, he conquered Jerusalem, and he brought the Ark of God back to Jerusalem. Having married women from so many different cultures and tribes, it ensued in a lot of family conflict for him. David was also a scandalous lover. He had an infamous love affair with Bathsheba, the wife of one of his army warriors, Uriah. David tried to cover up his mistake by making another mistake. And a few things happened because of that. First, the innocent man was killed. Second, while Bathsheba was still mourning the loss of her husband, David quickly moved her into his palace so that it wouldn't look like they had had an affair. Third, his army general Joab stopped trusting him. David was also a pretty unself-aware sinner at times. So when, after this situation with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan went to David and tried to give him a rhetorical message. He told him a story about a rich man that instead of using his own lamb to slay, he went and stole a lamb from the poor man and used that. And David had a response of anger at the rich man. He couldn't see what the prophet was getting at. But through the parable, Nathan invitingly held up a mirror for David. And when David's lack of self-awareness was evident, Nathan straight out told him, "You are the rich man." Nathan shone a light on David's soul, inviting him to self-awareness. To his credit, this did not make David defensive. Instead, David went into a period of deep anguish and remorseful repentance. So that idea of holding up a mirror for somebody and inviting them to self-awareness, that's what spiritual direction is all about, which I've also taken on some spiritual direction to help me along my journey. And it's really helpful to just hold up those mirrors for us along the way, because it's very easy to become unself-aware when we're trying to justify our actions or stay the victim. So David went into a real repentant state. His response was, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan told him that his sins are forgiven, but their child of sin will die, him and Bathsheba's child. And that spoke to me about consequences. So while we can experience forgiveness, there's still the practical consequences of our choices. David pled and pled for his son's life. He fasted and deprived himself of sleep, but to no avail. On the 7th day, his son died. And what I found interesting was that instead of getting bitter, David actually got up, washed himself, and went to the house of the Lord and worshipped. And I thought to myself, what did he know or discover about God that enabled him to do that after his son dying? And that made me quite reflective on, okay, using my difficult experiences to reflect on God. David the Paradox. So this quote is from Stephen Mackenzie's book. David's story reads like a modern soap opera with plenty of sex, violence, and struggles of power. Not what you'd expect to find in the Bible. Throughout his scandalous reign, David was an aggressive leader, a devious politician, an unscrupulous lover, and a ruthless war chief. He was also a healing musician, a stirring poet, an unrivaled warrior, a sincere and repentant soul, and a man after God's own heart. And if we read some of David's poetry, and I won't go into it now for time's sake, but some of the words that he uses in there are pretty strong. So he's crying out to God, "Do not ignore my plea. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, my spirit grows faint within me. My heart is dismayed. lonely and afflicted. Free me from my anguish. And my anguish increased, my heart grew hot within me. So these were all things that I could relate to, that David put words to in the Bible for me. Just for me, for all of us. So some things that I learnt that taught me about myself from David's story is that it's not the end of me and my life as I know it if I make horrible mistakes, or if others make horrible mistakes which hurt me. I'm still going to be okay. It's okay to be honest and transparent and authentic with myself, with God, with others, about the ways in which I am broken and about the ways in which I have broken others. It's okay to let myself move on from real and perceived missteps, mistakes and failures and their consequences. It is good and necessary for my freedom to forgive myself and accept forgiveness from others. I can give myself permission to succeed in life no matter how many times I've fumbled and tripped along the way. And I can give myself time and patience to grow into who I am. Like a seed needs time and quality air, water and light to grow into the tree that's inherent in it, I need to give myself time and the right environment to grow and not put pressure on myself. A few things that David's story taught me about God. That God can handle and does not turn away from honest expressions of doubt, despair, pain, shame, grief, anger, injustice, depression, anxiety. There's a place for all of these things in the context of God's goodness and grace. God actually respects and honours humility, repentance, efforts to make amends, honesty and perseverance. God allows and uses the process, no matter how messy or heartbreaking, to bring forth the truth of who I am, so that I and others can know who I truly am. My innate strength and wisdom and beauty and calm and creativity, I've discovered those along the way. Things that I was scared that weren't inside me. And I also learned that God or love always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. God never writes me or my story off, no matter what detours my journey takes, and no matter how often I stall or give up on myself. And here's a quote from John Lennon, which funnily enough, my dad quoted to me when I was in hospital. And I don't think my dad knows John Lennon, so he wouldn't have known it came from him. But the quote really helped me in that season of my life. And it's that everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. And I learned that through my journey, that if it's not okay yet, just keep going. Now, back to the dualistic and non-dualistic, we can't talk about that without mentioning Richard Rohr. He's got the 7 themes of alternate orthodoxy, and I'm going to skip over the first 4 because it's the next 3 that really spoke to me in my journey. These are from his book, Yes and, the Daily Meditations. So part of transformation is 5th one. The separate self is the problem, whereas most religion and most people make the shadow self the problem. This leads to denial, pretending, and projecting instead of real transformation into the divine. So that really spoke to me because I had a lot of separate selves when I was so fragmented from a lot of stuff in my childhood. And I became so fragmented that I couldn't see a cohesion in all of that. And so I just decided I'm just going to live without certain parts of me. You can only go so far when not all of you is on board. So I like this idea of the shadow self, integrating the shadow self rather than living as a separate self. The next theme is process. The path of descent is the path of transformation. Darkness, failure, relapse, death, and woundedness are our primary teachers rather than ideas or doctrines. And I can testify to that, definitely. And the final one there is goal. Reality is paradoxical and complementary. Non-dual thinking is the highest level of consciousness. Divine union, not private perfection, is the goal of all religion. So that non-dual thinking, allowing yourself to sit in the middle instead of swinging on the pendulum ends. So non-dualistic thinking is both and at the same time. So I can be depressed and suicidal and a Christian and connected to God. I can be really unsatisfied and yet at the same time really calm and assured that I'm okay. So I learned how to straddle all of that and two seemingly opposite viewpoints were coexisting inside of me. And because I was able to accept that within myself, I was able to offer that grace to others and let it exist in others. And I remember people, commenting things like, I'm so black and white and you're all grey, and they didn't know what to do with that. And it's a part of it, I think, is needing that control of knowledge. And when you give that up, you're okay to not know and sit in the middle. The goal in non-dualistic thinking is always acceptance and evolution, not separation and eviction. So I stopped evicting parts of me that didn't make sense. Instead, I just let them exist and come out when they came out and explored them and enjoyed them along the way. Now, for time's sake, I won't read out these quotes from Richard Rohr, but I highly recommend his work on non-dualistic thinking. For me personally, what I learnt is that the more we can break through the dualistic either-or mentality, the sooner we are on our way to nurturing greater consciousness and freedom for ourselves and for others. When I think in black and white, I miss all the shades of colour in between, and that's such a shame. So I love to just let things be what they are, whether I understand them or not, because eventually if I need to understand it, it'll come to me. I want to finish with lyrics of a song called The Fruitful Darkness. This is by Trevor Hall. When I look back on those years gone by, all those mountains standing in my mind, I could have folded, could have turned around, but all good stories have their ups and downs. So I had to find a way through. I had to find a way through. The fruitful darkness is all around us in bloom. The dark within my dark is where I found my light. The fruit became the doorway, and now it's open wide. My journey has taught me not to be afraid of pain and darkness, but to explore it when it comes to the forefront, to find the seeds and the fruit that are inherent in it. So back to this quote. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. The ocean is ripe with beauty, with wildness, with scary creatures, with depths, with shallows, and all of it is part of the one ocean. And whatever's lurking inside you, inside me, it's okay, it's there, so let's deal with it. And that's what I want to leave it as a challenge, and also an invitation, that whatever it is that you're perhaps scared or uncomfortable with facing or asking questions about, just let it exist, because it's got lots to teach you. Thank you.